Technology is everywhere, and so should a systematic philosophical reflection on technology. The Working Group on Philosophy of Technology, WGPT, at the University of Leuven in Belgium aims to create a platform to do precisely that. You're listening to WGPTalks, a series where we give the opportunity to our own members to talk about what fascinates them at the crossroads of technology and society.
Today we talk with Jan De Bruyne on autonomous vehicles and liability. A trope in science fiction is flying cars, but they do not seem to be a reality yet. But another trope is that we do not have to drive our own cars anymore, but that they drive themselves. And that seems to be more of a reality nowadays. Today we are together here with Jan De Bruyne, who is a postdoc at CiTiP, the KU Leuven, and a member of our working group, and also a senior researcher with the Flemish Knowledge Centre for Data and Society. Welcome, Jan.
Yes, good morning, and thank you for having me. I look forward to the talk that we'll have.
So you are an expert on the legal aspects of AI in general, but of autonomous vehicles in particular. What are autonomous vehicles?
Well, to say it, I am indeed working on self-driving vehicles already for a longer time. I did my PhD on liability and certification in Ghent University, but during my PhD, I became fascinated by liability and damage caused by self-driving vehicles and by extension artificial intelligence, which I now do on a daily basis, the legal, ethical aspects of AI with a focus on liability. Now, if we talk about self-driving vehicles, well, this is, of course, one of the most important visible features of artificial intelligence. It's also the topic I think that is mostly debated upon since I've been working on. So it's one of these hot topics for a longer time. What are self-driving vehicles? Well, you do have several grades of autonomy. For example, now you have traditional vehicles in which the user, the driver, still has to fully control the movements. It's a traditional vehicle, you remain in charge. This is the stage 1 or 0, depending upon which scale you use. At the other end of the scale, you have level 5 vehicles, which are fully autonomous. And this is the idea that we have, that you sit in a vehicle and no longer have to do anything. You can read, or you can play a game, or you can sleep, or you can work. This is the ideal scenario. According to some, we would eventually evolve towards there. Well, in between, we do have several other levels, level 2, 3, 4, in which autonomy gradually becomes more important, in which the higher you are, the less control you have as a user. At the moment, we are at level 2 or 3 vehicles. So the idea of fully autonomous vehicles, they do not exist yet. They are being used in certain specific closed areas, but in traffic, in normal city centers, for example, you will not see them because of many other problems. So far, we do not have fully autonomous vehicles yet, which is important to know. We still have to control the decisions taken by the AI system.
Yeah, because there is a bit of probably confusion among the public to what extent they are a reality yet, because the news is already there that they are there, that they are on the road, or at least being tested. So in that sense, they are not a reality yet. But what are they capable of right now, these self-driving vehicles?
I think technologically a lot of is possible already, and it also depends upon the environment where you can use them. For example, we have famous experiments with vessels that are used, for example, in airports where you have these autonomous shuttles. But there again, you have a closed area in which there are predictable risks, for example. The problem is that when you start using technology, autonomous systems in city centers or with unpredictable risk, it becomes way more dangerous. So indeed, the vision that we had in 2015, 2014, when I started working on liability of self-driving vehicles, the idea was that we would have them fully autonomous vehicles by 2020. It turned out to be not true, of course, but we have this optimism that it became more of a pessimism or realism, maybe, that we are not there yet, despite claims of for example, Elon Musk and other technological companies. The self-driving vehicle is still not a reality yet. And I think the most important future there for liability is that you as a user still have to control the movements and the motions of the vehicle. So you remain in charge. So as long as a human driver or user remains in charge, I don't think we can talk about autonomous vehicles. And I'd like to add in this regard that there has been class actions, so legal claims against the companies. I think it was Tesla, but I'm not sure anymore. Tesla in the United States by consumers that claim, yeah, this is misleading information. Autonomous vehicles are not autonomous yet. The term autopilot may be confusing because in the end, the user, the driver, still has to control the vehicles and take over, for example, when there is this beep, 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 beep. So it is a bit of a terminological issue as well. Is it still autonomous?
So indeed, there is a bit of debate and confusion to what the autonomy means here, but also the vehicle. So people probably think of a car, but you mentioned buses already. Is it also applied in other contexts? Like you can also think of airplanes that are fully autonomous or semi-autonomous.
Of course, autonomous systems are also used with autopilots in planes and so on. In shipping, increasingly becoming autonomous as well. But the problem is that at sea, or maybe less in the air, but at sea, there are less risks. So in traffic, there's so many risks which you cannot program. A child might cross the road, there might be another vehicle, pedestrians. So there's so many risks, which makes, I think, traffic to normal vehicles a bit more different than the other sectors. And of course, you can fully automate systems in closed circuits, for example, in airport shuttles, because the risks there are less visible. There are less risks than in traffic, for example. And I think this is a major difference. What are the risks that could be a reality?
Indeed, you mentioned already a couple of times risks, dangers, etc. So the reason why these autonomous vehicles are not there yet is not so much technological, but mainly societal, ethical, or in your case, legal. So my question then is, how are they indeed regulated nowadays?
Just as a matter of clarity, I'm of course not an engineer, so technologically a lot is possible as well, but not entirely fully autonomous vehicles because you need a lot of data. You need also your road infrastructures need to be adapted to self-driving vehicles. So you could actually look at it as a driving cell phone, and you have everything that needs to be connected and everything that needs to be compatible with this autonomous vehicles that are being used. So this is a technological issue. As to the legal, societal, and ethical aspects, well, they do create a lot of debates, food for thought, some ideas. For example, we all know these ethical dilemmas, the trolley dilemma, for example. The impact on jobs, for example, is another concern. The impact on environment, on mobility, on public space. These are all issues. And I focus on these regulatory elements. And the question is, are there already applicable regulations? Well, you do have a lot of traditional traffic regulations that do apply to normal cars. And as I mentioned, we do not yet have fully autonomous vehicles. So the applicable current framework applies to self-driving vehicles with the challenges it poses because they become increasingly more autonomous, but the traditional framework that has been adopted for non-autonomous vehicles and for traditional vehicles in which there are non-autonomous options still apply. But in this regard, the Belgian legislature and in many other countries as well are aware of this. And for example, we have a provision in the highway code that provides that the federal government can allow exceptions on the traffic code to do tests with autonomous vehicles. For example, one of the provisions in the highway code relates to the fact that every vehicle needs to have a driver that can be in control of the vehicle. Well, there again, you could rely on this specific provision to allow an exception to do testing with autonomous vehicles, which is of course necessary from a technological perspective, but also to adapt the legal framework. So there are some exceptions, but the main key takeaway is actually that the applicable framework exists already.
Well, it's a bit of a tricky question. Do self-driving vehicles then not pose any kind of new need for regulation? Besides then, well, the question of the driver, of course, but otherwise it's the same as with normal vehicles?
No, of course they do. They do pose a lot of legal issues and a lot of legal challenges. For example, one question that we face, you already mentioned it, is the question, who is the driver of these autonomous vehicles? Because we traditionally see the driver as the person as sitting behind the steering wheel. But in autonomous vehicles, the more autonomy there will be, you could also ask, well, is the other passenger not a driver as well? In this regard, we looked at case law in Belgium, which qualifies the driver as the person responsible for driving or the person that is in charge of putting the vehicle into motion. And so you have two criteria, the factual criterion, which actually says that the one that moves the vehicle is the driver, and the more normative criterion relates to the person that is in charge, that is responsible of driving. If you apply these two criteria, well, you could still say that in these level 2, 3 vehicles, you as a driver, you still remain responsible. Hence, you will be qualified as the driver. Another challenge is if you look at the traffic regulations, they are directed towards the driver. Even if you would assume that you do have a driver in semi-autonomous vehicles, you could say there's a driver, but the infringements of the traffic code are committed by the vehicle itself. Let me take this with an example. It is the vehicle that crosses a red light. The only thing that you don't do as a driver is you do not prevent the vehicle from doing the violation. You sit and you should have intervened, for example, but the initial violation, crossing the red light, is done by the vehicle. Likewise, if you do not give priority to the right, it is actually the vehicle that does not give priority to the right to you. But there again, the question is, and I think from an ethical perspective, you need to attribute this act of the vehicle to the driver. Is this feasible? Is this possible? Is this fair to actually attribute the initial violation of the code of the vehicle, crossing the red light, towards the driver? There's a lot of discussion there. We can discuss this further, but this is, for example, a legal question. How do we deal with these kind of situations?
That's a very interesting point in the sense that it shows something that most people probably don't think about, namely that this notion of driver is not just a descriptive term, but really a normative or at least also a legal term, that you have to ascribe that role to someone, and that has to do with responsibility, with who is in charge, who is responsible for the actions by the thing being driven.
Exactly, because the driver is a legal notion with legal consequences. It is the driver that has to comply with several obligations and traffic regulations. Hence, this important question is, until when is there still a driver in these autonomous vehicles, and who should it be?
So in that sense, there will be repercussions for traffic regulations, because if I understood you correctly, this notion of driver is very much ingrained in the current traffic regulations. And that will pose really a challenge by these self-driving vehicles, that we have to rethink what it means to regulate traffic in terms not of drivers, but of vehicles.
This will be pressing the more autonomy there will be, of course, but still now we are level 2 and 3 of autonomous vehicles, in which you as a driver still remain in charge. I think the main challenge will be there, not so much from a legal perspective, but still on education. What can we still expect from the driver? Should we not think about giving new skills when getting your license, to your driving license? And because fully vehicles become more autonomous, okay, still not fully autonomous, but we do have autonomous applications in vehicles, but still the traditional driving license is maybe based on skills that are no longer necessary. Maybe we need an understanding to give to pupils on how these systems work, when not to intervene, the importance of keeping control, even if it is commercialized as being fully autonomous.
That's a very interesting point. So another repercussion is really to rethink what it means to become a driver, what it means to be allowed to drive these vehicles. Should everyone be allowed to drive an autonomous vehicle, even if you do not have to drive it yourself? Do you need ethical or at least legal education of what it means to be responsible for that vehicle? You cannot just jump onto the car without any kind of repercussions. Is that the kind of image that we are going towards or should go towards?
Yeah, definitely. I think when increasingly, but I think you can also back me up on this. I think there's a need in the broader AI revolution towards more digital literacy, for example, at different levels, not only for judges or not only for population in general, but also for people that start driving, start using these autonomous vehicles. Not so much on the autonomous systems themselves, how do they work, but also on the fact that you remain still responsible as a driver. And in this regard, there has been a case in the Netherlands already, in which someone was fined because I think he was using his phone behind the steering wheel. He said in a Tesla, yeah, but I'm not the driver. The driver is the autonomous autopilot. So you start seeing that it occurs in case law. The judge eventually said, no, you as a driver, you remain responsible for driving. You remain responsible for the motion of the vehicle. So I think there should be a claim that we are still responsible. And I think it can be far going, because I already mentioned that you as a driver, can you be held responsible for a violation, for example, crossing the red light, that has been done by the autopilot? This question of attribution also becomes important. And there you can find solutions in case law from the Court of Cassation in the 70s as the highest court in Belgium. In that case, it concerned a driving pupil and a driving instructor. And it was held that the driving instructor, as he was responsible for driving and as such the driver, can be held liable, can be held responsible for the actions committed by the pupil. Well, you could, by analogy, you could say, well, the acts of the autonomous system can be attributed to the user, to the driver. So, but a lot of people think the more autonomy there is, I cannot be held responsible. But up until now, this is not true. You are still in charge and you need to control the vehicle.
The image that we should have of ourselves is not having no responsibility, but even having more responsibility in the form of an instructor. I remember of my own training as a driver as well, that it was quite, well, impressive if you think about it, how many inexperienced drivers these instructors have to instruct, etc. And I was already worrying about all the potential things that could go wrong and do go wrong in these cases. And so in that sense, that is really an image of more responsibility, not only ethically again, but also legally probably in that case. Should we see ourselves as instructors? Is that a better metaphor then?
There's a lot of debate ongoing. There's still some research is still ongoing on these issues. I think you could still see yourself as, I would say, as maybe as a user of the vehicle, as an operator. And in the broader AI discussions, the liability of the operators, the front-end operator, as at the European Union, there's a lot of debate on this, and I will not go too technically, but you shift towards other terms, but still, in the end, I think that, this is my personal opinion, I think that the responsibility remains the same. You are in charge of the vehicle, even if there are autonomous options, you as a driver remain in charge. Of course, the more autonomy there will be, as I mentioned already, in the level 5 with fully autonomous vehicles, then of course you as a user, you do not have influence on the behavior of the vehicle. So then it's quite logical that you cannot be held liable. But up until that moment, you still have to comply with these obligations to control your vehicles.
Let's make it concrete, specific. Imagine I'm being driven by my self-driving car, let's put it that way, as it currently exists, and there is an accident. I hit someone, she or he is in the hospital or even died. Am I responsible? That's the first question. And let me put it immediately. Is there a difference between different countries? Am I responsible in certain countries, for instance, in Europe, or not in the United States? Or is it nowadays, would it be the same in all areas?
Well, this is, of course, the challenge of the law. And again, I will very much simplify this because you, of course, have a whole insurance system that is also applicable. And so most of the times your insurances will cover you. But I will just look at the question of liability. So with regard to the liability as a driver, it is the same. If you commit a violation of the traffic code, then you can be held liable. This is this fault-based liability. In Belgium, for example, if you violate a specific legal provision, you can be held liable. You can also be held liable under fault-based liability if you act negligently. So in Belgium, you have two elements of a fault-based liability, namely the violation of a specific rule, for example, not crossing a red light, or negligence. You can be held liable if you do not act as a normal, prudent person placed in the same circumstances. And this is in a lot of countries the same. Well, you could there also say, if you get this sign of your autonomous system to take over, and you do not take over, well, you could say, well, you acted negligently. You should have taken over the moment you got the sign from your vehicle. But there again, I think it can be very challenging to apply this regime of negligence because, of course, cognitive research already showed that you may have to take over in a fraction of a second. The moment you got your signals, you have to take over. And it turned out that it's unrealistic to expect this. By taking over in such stressful situations, you may even increase the risk. You see that there are some challenges there as well for the driver. When you look at other countries, well, this is, of course, what is the beauty, but also the challenge of law. The law is by principle national bound. There are, of course, European provisions, but most of these liability provisions are national. So the situation in the United States or in other countries, I may not know this because there are several national differences. And this makes it very challenging as well.
Imagine that the mistake or the accident happens not because of an action by my hand, not even because I failed to intervene in a certain moment, but that there is something wrong in the algorithm or that an update that is supposed to have happened did not happen yet, something like that. Until now, we only discussed about the driver, but there is, of course, also the one who makes the product, who makes the self-driving vehicle. Is the producer also responsible? Or liable? Is that a way to think about it as well?
Of course, the more autonomy you'll get, the less liability can lie on the user or the driver. You need to find other parties to claim compensation for things that go wrong. There again, we have this product liability directive at the European level. So this is the product liability is harmonized at the European level. I will discuss this later. But before, you should also know that it is challenging really to, again, come to this fully autonomous level, because a lot of these traffic regulations, and this is important for the liability of the producer as well, require also some subjective requirements. I took the example of crossing a red light. This is very simple. You can program this into a vehicle and into the software. If the light is red, you stop. But Belgian law and highway code in Belgium is full of subjective elements as well. For example, it is mentioned that you need to adapt your speed towards the circumstances. But this is very difficult to implement these subjective requirements into code, put very simply. You have to be double careful and double voorzichtig when going on a roundabout. But this requirement of double carefulness, how do you program this into these vehicles? So this is important to understand this liability of producers as well, because it may also challenge them.
So you mentioned these more subjective elements, but do they really matter? What would be a potential accident legal case that would be determined by these subjective elements? Or do you have an example of that?
Yeah, I already gave the example of double carefulness, but also in certain circumstances, the policeman or policewomen can take over traffic, can take over the signs and regulate traffic in certain circumstances. But there again, how do you program this? This is very difficult, I think, to program into codes. When does a vehicle know to stop because of this?
And then if an accident happens because the car ignores a police person and just drives through something or drives against something, that would be then a problem for subjective elements.
In addition to these objective traffic rules, there is also a subjective component, which makes it difficult to program this, to include this in the coding of, for example, this idea of code is law. Well, these subjective elements make it difficult to really apply this. And this, of course, is important for this producer's liability. And this is the question where we're heading toward. Well, the under product liability directive, so the producer is liable when a damage is caused by a defect in the product. But you could say this vehicle can, for example, be a product for which the producer can then be held liable in case it was wrong, let's say, in case it was defective. But applying this product liability directive, which is quite easy, for example, for a chair, if your chair causes damage because of a defect, well, you can be held liable. But for autonomous systems, for artificial intelligence in general, but also for self-driving vehicles, this regime, which has been implemented in national law, creates a lot of legal issues. For example, could you say that software is a product? This is a question that is very important for the scope of application of this product liability directive. Some, for example, say, no, standalone software is not a product, but a service. How does the product liability directive define product? Well, a product is defined as a movable item. Some say, well, this does not apply to software because software is intangible, and movable refers to tangible products. And indeed, in Belgium, for example, we have this requirement that the product is defined as a movable, tangible item. So as long as we do not consider software as being tangible, then it does not fall under this product liability directive. So a lot of legal debates on this issue as well. Another element, when do you qualify standalone software, an algorithm, for example? When do you qualify this as defective? There's a whole test. It's defective when it does not provide the safety that one is entitled to expect. So you look at the reasonable safety expectations of a consumer. And so what can you expect from safety? But there again, the problem is with these autonomous vehicles is that safety is often emphasized as one of the benefits. In 2015, you saw a lot of commercials saying, yes, autonomous vehicles are safer than traditional vehicles. But by increasing the safety, you also increase your risk of liability because of this notion of defectiveness. And you expect more safety, so you can be held more easily liable. So it's becoming really challenging to apply these concepts towards the notions of artificial intelligence and standalone software, algorithms, and so on and so on.
But is that particular to AI and self-driving vehicles? I can imagine similar ambiguities about defectiveness, about software, etc., also popping up in other domains. Do they really pose a kind of genuine new problem, or is it just the same kind of trouble, but perhaps on a more extensive scale?
Well, I think still product liability directive or product liability regimes, whether it is a technological, new technology, another technology, or artificial intelligence, I think the major problem there lies that you have to prove it. For example, you still have to prove, although it is a strict liability regime, and so the producer is held liable the moment there's a defect in the product that causes damage. So you do not have to prove that the producer acted negligently. No, just the mere fact that a defect in a product causes damage is sufficient to establish liability. But again, how will you establish this? I think the burden of proof for consumers is very high. How will you establish that software is defective? How will you establish that there is a flaw in the system? So these problems pose themselves, raise again, and these questions raised with any kind of technology which is new, for example. The difference with artificial intelligence and hence the AI used in self-driving vehicles is that, and I mentioned it already, that the producer is liable for the damage caused by a defect in the product, but only at the moment for defects that existed at the moment when the product is put on the market. It is, of course, logical. You cannot be held liable for something that occurred 10 years after you put the product on the market. And so you're only liable, the producer is only liable for those defects that existed at the moment when the product is put on the market. Let's make it concrete. If you have a self-driving car that does not work with a flaw in the system the moment it is put on the market, well, there can be liability. The problem with AI, and this is an answer to your question, is that AI is very unique because AI has got the self-learning abilities. We all know this, the non-transparency, opaqueness, but also the fact that it's self-learning, adapts itself to situations. So it can well be that the software used in your self-driving vehicle works perfectly fine the moment it is put on the market, but becomes defective of such an update, or becomes defective because of self-learning abilities. But for such kind of defects, the producer is no longer liable. So again, this is unique to AI systems because of the self-learning capacities that the moment of putting the product into circulation on the market will become tricky when it relates to self-learning AI systems which are used in self-driving vehicles.
So far, we have talked about the responsibility or liability of drivers, of the producers. There is a kind of third partner here, society. We mentioned at the beginning, for instance, that there are self-driving vehicles, but they only work within very specific controlled settings. And you can, of course, imagine that the solution, if you would want to have self-driving vehicles all around you, is to make the streets, the cities, the whole society as a whole simple and controllable. Or in other words, does society, and I mean like political actors, cities, do they have a kind of responsibility according to you, or should they have a kind of responsibility or even liability in the sense of how they design the streets, the cities wherein these self-driving vehicles will move around?
Well, this is a very difficult question for a legal scholar who is no expert in mobility and urban planning and so on. But what I think, and you hear this in debates as well, is the question, do we really want to invest in self-driving vehicles, or do we invest in other types of mobility? For example, cycling. You increasingly see that cyclists are becoming a very important way of transportation. Public transport, should we not invest in public transport? So I think it's all related together, because investing in one kind of mobility type has effects on the other mobility types, let's say. With regard to self-driving cars, I think there's also a difficulty that you will have a phase in which you will have fully autonomous vehicles, maybe suppose you have fully autonomous vehicles, semi-autonomous vehicles, traditional autonomous vehicles. How do you make this work? How do you need specific streets for autonomous vehicles depending upon the stage of autonomy? How will this interact? It's a very tricky question. And I gave a talk I think 2 years ago already. And I think you asked me the question, should we not oblige the society to introduce that everyone uses autonomous vehicles? But this is a very radical, revolutionary approach. But I don't know if this is feasible. I don't think I'm qualified to really give an answer to this, but I think it will be challenging, at least. That can be said.
Big questions, but it highlights how choosing for self-driving vehicles will not only imply a cost for the users or for the producers, but will have societal consequences. And also, I would say, in liability, probably, because indeed, as you said, the scenario where you have a mix between self-driving vehicles and classical vehicles, it's not just a question of how should we allow the mixing of these, should we have different roads, but also of how to follow up on that. I mean, you gave the example of the Dutch example of the driver who was texting or calling behind the wheel, where it was a semi-self-driving vehicle. If you would have real autonomous vehicles, how can you, as a legislator, but also as a police force, enforce the laws if it's unclear, for instance, whether the car you're faced with is autonomous or not autonomous? Will there not be a huge amount of ambiguity in enforcing the law?
I think the moment you have fully autonomous vehicles, the moment you have everything autonomous, there would no longer be a need to enforce the law. Simply because the law code will be the law. It will all be implemented in software systems, and vehicles will communicate with each other with infrastructure. So there will be no need to enforce. There will no longer be the need for policemen, for example. So this is the question of fully autonomous vehicles. But I think the stage towards getting there, if we would ever get there, there's a lot of ambiguity indeed, as you mentioned, because you will have a whole I think there will be legal chaos because you could have some kind of control for certain users, but some users will have more control, but some users will use traditional vehicles. And that is why I think that producers, manufacturers, and society will still require that the one inside the vehicle and behind the steering wheel will still need to control this, just to prevent some legal chaos, let's say, because it will create legal certainty that you have that one person that still has to remain in charge, that has to take over whenever necessary, that needs control of the vehicle. But the question will be, of course, that the benefits of self-driving vehicles cannot be used as long as the user has to take control. Societal benefits of self-driving vehicles, as promised, for example, less traffic accidents, more time to do other things. Yeah, this cannot be done as long as you do not have full autonomous vehicles.
We have slowly slipped into another question also of future perspectives. So you, for instance, you mentioned well, there is not a legal chaos yet, but it might come there. And the other one was that a kind of future where there's no need for laws, there's no need for police force, as you even said. Do you think that is really realistic? I think that provokes a number of questions also on the nature of law. Is it really imaginable, possible that you can implement laws perfectly in these self-driving vehicles without any need for interpretation, ambiguity, people still checking whether it is applied in the right way?
This is exactly the subjective elements which I think are very difficult to implement in code. You cannot program everything because there's so much unpredictability of risks. So this is the reason why I think fully autonomous vehicles may not exist, because it may be technologically to a certain extent possible, but there's so many unpredictable risks that you need to integrate in this code, and I think there will be a real challenge. So I agree with you that it will be very challenging.
So you don't think there will ever be fully autonomous vehicles in the future?
Again, I'm not an engineer, so it also, if you look at people, some are very pessimistic, some are very optimistic. So I think it's still unclear. I think there will be technological challenges, but I think most important thing, there will be in traffic, the unpredictability of risks makes it very difficult, I think. And I think this is a real challenge to get towards this fully autonomous vehicles. And I think that you could see that in 2014-15, there was the self-driving vehicles. It was really a hype. It was like much expected, the future. But increasingly, you see another image of also as a society, do we want to go to fully autonomous vehicles? Because increasingly, you also see there's been a research, an enquête by VIAS, I think, which shows that there's a decrease in trust in these autonomous vehicles. So even if it would be technologically possible, legally possible, I don't know whether society is ready to go towards fully autonomous vehicles, not in the least, because there may be other mobility alternatives that could be even better than autonomous vehicles.
Very interesting. So self-driving vehicles is not just a technical problem, but clearly also a question of legal, ethical, societal questions. And indeed, whether we want it, whether it's worthwhile to have these autonomous vehicles every science fiction book is dreaming about. Yeah.
I just discussed the legal as a final note. I discussed the legal aspects. But again, I think for this, there are also many ethical issues that still need to be resolved before going towards fully autonomous vehicles. And the question is, can they be resolved, these issues? So again, it's a very complex story, but I think there is a need of the multidisciplinarity, teams of people working on these AI self-driving cars related issues, ethical, technological, legal. So the decrease of multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity is really important to make AI in general work for the society as a whole.
Need for more reflection on self-driving vehicles. I think this podcast episode was already a good first step towards. Thank you, Jan, for your inspiring reflections on the legal aspects of self-driving vehicles and liability. Thank you for being here. I hope to, of course, see you again, perhaps in a future episode to talk more about this or a related topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. And I look forward to this as well, Massimiliano.